Race has been used to group individuals with similar phenotypical characteristics since the 17th century, influencing our identities, cultures, beliefs, and attitudes. As centuries have passed, racism has moved away from being a biological understanding to one where racism is embedded into the entire structure of a nation. Let's take the case of Colin Kaepernick, a popular American football player who first spoke out against injustices faced by the African American community in 2016. Instead of promoting his message for racial justice, many Americans resented him for speaking out given his privileged position, a response which was then mirrored by the media, who played down the wider issue and discredited him. This is only one story. Through addressing African American struggles in particular, we aim to break down the different lenses through which racism can be analysed, critiquing the lack of scope in both scientific and institutional racism, and acknowledging the deeper and more comprehensive arguments structural racism puts forward. In this way, we will be able to come to a more holistic understanding of the multifaceted and complex nature of modern racism. Biological study of race has shaped the conceptualization of racism in a very significant way, dating back to when race experts claimed evolutionary bases such as IQ caused disparities in social outcomes such as educational attainment and wealth between racial groups. Through a mix of academic discourse, racial differences were twisted into reflections of racial superiority and inferiority, reaching the general public.
You basically have a couple of ways to test for cultural bias. One of them is there a racial difference in the predictive validity that seems to us highly likely that both genes and the environment have something to do with racial differences?
Although these studies illuminate disparities, it provides a limited explanation of where racist biases originate from and how they are manifested, as it does not explain why social structures give preferences to certain races over others. If we understand the racial underpinning of societal institutions, we can work to deconstruct divisions on society. This is where institutional racism provides a more comprehensive understanding of the issue. Racism in an institutional sphere can be defined as any institutional activity which results in the subordination and oppression of minorities. This is evidenced by the disproportionate number of African Americans incarcerated. Despite only comprising 13% of the US population, African Americans make up nearly 40% of the nation's inmates. Academics have pointed to this being a consequence of police treatment. During routine checks, police are more likely to unfairly stop an African American than a white suspect. This is compounded by media attention, as the portrayal of black suspects as dangerous allows media narratives to influence perceptions towards African Americans. This institutional definition is limited in its scope as it fails to address the privileged nature of those in power. For example, although higher education is accessed by many diverse people, this isn't reflected in those delivering the teaching. This paves the way for further analysis into the sociological structures that can be analysed fully through the lens of structural racism. The Aspen Institute describes structural racism as the most prevalent form of racism, manifested by hierarchies of privilege through the institutional, historical, cultural, and interpersonal practices of society. This allows us to analyze how racial inequality has been facilitated through social contexts and institutions such as mainstream media, especially in the US, where it can influence and shape perceptions on a mass scale. The Kaiser Foundation determined that black people make up 26% of recipients of means-tested welfare programs, yet reports reveal that overrepresentation has inflated these statistics. Media analysis conducted by the University of Illinois found that 59% of poor people depicted were black, in comparison to 17% of white people, despite constituting 66% of the poor population. The Sentencing Project found similar patterns regarding violent crime. The 10% of cases with black on white crime make up 42% of cases televised. Such narratives have been weaponized by politicians to gain support for policies that disproportionately impact racial minorities. This is not a new phenomenon. The National Housing Act of 1934 openly denied federal backing for home loans to black families or helping low-income whites. If discrimination and legal housing persisted far beyond its criminalization, in 1968. Black people were found to be 2.8 times more likely to be denied for a loan prior to the 2008 financial crisis, and when approved, were 2.4 times more likely to receive a subprime loan than white applicants. This demonstrates disparities in the treatment of African Americans on a fundamentally structural level. Inability to access basic housing, among other things, significantly impacts their quality of life. The implementation of positive discrimination measures, such as affirmative action, may have worked to reduce racial inequality for historically excluded groups, but has failed to address structural issues. The only way racism can fully be unpacked is through a deeper understanding of the socio-political context that have allowed for the marginalization of racial minorities to occur, precisely what structural racism provides. The proliferation of liberal movements and supposedly improved attitudes towards inclusivity may influence us to feel a sense of racial equality, but is this truly accurate? The Kaepernick case revitalized the topic of race in the US. He drew attention to the oppression of African Americans and was subsequently chastised and treated like a traitor in order to justify the ill treatment he received. The US may have housed the civil rights movement of the 60s, but it still struggles to address its problems with racial inequality towards marginalized groups. The US is undoubtedly not the only victim of racism. Its presence is apparent both covertly and overtly in societies across the world. All other understandings of racism emerge as a result of structural issues. The social fabric justifies the status quo of inequality to be accepted. We need to move past surface-level conceptions of discrimination, critically viewing how our lives and societies are shaped, in order to address prejudice and highlight injustice for a truly equal society.